In 2009, a young Iraqi pianist named Zuhal Sultan invited musicians from around the conflict-ridden country to upload audition videos to create the National Youth Orchestra of Iraq. Since then, the orchestra members' passion for music has propelled them forward even amid the constant obstacles that can make it difficult and sometimes dangerous to meet, rehearse, practice, and perform. Under the direction of conductor Paul McAlinden, the orchestra has persevered, bringing together Arab and Kurdish youths and traveling abroad to meet and work with other young musicians. The music you just heard is an excerpt from the orchestra's 2012 performance of Habibu by Osama Abdul Rasal, an Arab-Iraqi composer living in Belgium. This year, they hope to come to the U.S. to work with the Elgin Youth Symphony in Illinois and perform in Elgin, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. The orchestra has turned to Kickstarter to raise $30,000 towards the trip by June 17th. As of May 24th, they had raised just over $4,000. I reached out to Sultan, who is now studying law in Glasgow, to talk about her experiences and what she hopes a U.S. tour will provide the orchestra members.
Well, first and foremost, I am a pianist, and basically, when I was in Baghdad, I went to music school, and at some point when I was 15, I joined the Iraqi National Symphony Orchestra. You know, at the time where the country was going through lots of political and turmoil, and things were not quite okay. Not that they are okay at the moment, but it was a sense where the orchestra was doing these secret concerts, and it was not safe to play your music outside, but still those people who managed to come to the concerts, they were filled with hope, and they feel like I always met people saying, you know, if there's classical music, if there are still people believing in culture at this time, then, you know, we have better hope for the future. And it sort of made sense that, you know, if this message can come out of the older generation, then imagine what it would mean to the people of the country and even around the world who are witnessing what's happening to Iraq. To see that the younger generation from all over the country, not just Baghdad, getting together, playing their music and playing world music, it just made sense at the time, and it still does, despite the challenges of putting together the project. And what's really crazy about the orchestra, not just the fact that, you know, classical music, especially at this time, it's not really prevalent, and there are no teachers around, and most of the institutions are either, you know, really lacking in facilities and in faculty, but it's also lacking in resources. So most of the musicians are actually teaching themselves, you know, from whatever they can find online or some friends who already know music. But the fact that it's just having to build everything from scratch, and having the musicians who themselves perhaps cannot communicate with each other properly because they speak different languages, coming from Kurdistan, in which they speak Kurdish, and then coming from the Arab part of the country, Baghdad, and so it's just laden with challenges, but that's the beauty of the project and the beauty of bringing people together from different cultures.
Well, tell us a little bit more about that. Over the last several years, as this has really coalesced, what have you seen among your friends and among the newer members as they've come to work together?
It's not easy, and I remember the first day ever the orchestra sat down for rehearsals, and it wasn't just bad musically, it was just people did not know what to do with each other. Most of the musicians, not all, but most of them have never been in an orchestra, probably never had a proper lesson in their whole lives. It was a bit disastrous, to be honest. But it just, you know, at the time, it just took 2 to 3 weeks. And I've seen them progress. They were able to communicate with each other, and they used music for that, you know, not just classical music. They sat down on a bus going from the rehearsal to their accommodation, listening to, you know, their own cultural pop music and dancing together. I think that's what really bonded them. And I know some of the orchestra members who have been able to get into the orchestra in the past a few years have been able to learn Kurdish, and some of the Kurdish members of the orchestra have been able to learn Arabic and communicate with each other, which I think is absolutely fantastic. I know one of my friends, she's almost fluent in Kurdish now just because she's been going to the orchestra. So it's just, you know, sometimes conflicts happen because we do not know much about each other. So when you bring different people who think, oh, we cannot communicate, but then show them that they have so many similarities, you know, conflict becomes just something that should have never existed. So it's really amazing.
What are you looking forward to most about the tour this year to the U.S.?
In my opinion, this will be perhaps our biggest tour, in the sense that we've always wanted to, bring the orchestra to the United States. I think there are plenty of emotions involved, considering what's been happening in the past few years, but also because we have not spread our message enough to the States yet. We've done tours in Europe and the United Kingdom, but I think it's important for the musicians to experience the American culture and to have the opportunity to sit down with the American musicians that we're going to have from the Elgin Youth Symphony Orchestra, and to have that cultural exchange, and for the American musicians themselves to realize, that Iraqi young musicians are just like them, and they love music just the same. And I think it's going to be really fantastic.
What type of response have you found through Kickstarter at this point? And what other fundraising elements have you included to make it over here?
Fundraising for this year, to be honest, has been incredibly challenging, not because of the cost or the amount of cost involved, but it's very difficult to fundraise when all over the world, really, there's been economic challenges. But I think so far, lots of people have responded positively to the message. But at the moment, we are still very much short. And we hope that at this point and in the next few days, we'll be able to grab more attention and just let people know, and for people to realize that this is really, really important for the Iraqi musicians, and it will be really beneficial for them if they get to the United States.
It's been pretty inspiring hearing about what some of these young musicians have to deal with just in order to play their music and perform their music. What are some of the stories that you've heard or your own experiences of the challenges just to get to rehearsal, just to practice, just to be a musician in Iraq?
Well, at some point, specifically in 2005, 6, 7, 8, it was really, really difficult to carry an instrument with you. Just carry it with you on the streets, going to the rehearsal. Lots of people would mistake you for a terrorist or an insurgent and carrying a weapon. And there was a point as well where, music was not recognized by extremists as something that you should do. And so I know that for a fact that some musicians would have to use their mutes, would have to put a duvet over their walls and their doors just to practice at home. Even inside one's room, it was difficult for the musicians to practice, but they persevered and they have always been doing that, which is amazing, because it's not only difficult to learn a thing by yourself, but to actually have the time and find the place and location to learn it is also a challenge for these musicians. So what they get out of the summer course when they travel and when they're coming to the United States is not just essential education, but also just time to be themselves, time to practice freely, and they do. I mean, last year, some of them practiced for almost 10 hours, and I could hear them all through the night. They just love it. They love to do it, and it makes them feel alive, which I know for a fact that most of them, when they're back home, they don't feel that way.
Have you seen a number of them really turn their music into solid careers? What are some of the success stories that you're seeing? I
think most of them, before coming to the orchestra and before realized, they've just learned music because they love it. They hope they could have a career, but most of them didn't really believe that they could. But now that a lot of them are teaching, and some of them have their own mini ensemble in their own little villages and cities, and so they're using their knowledge, they're using what they learned, and they're teaching it to others, and then it's spreading out. Our message is spreading out, and the music is spreading out to a country that that's been so laden with violence and conflict, and I think it's really contributing to perhaps a happier mental state for many. You mentioned you're studying law. What's your future plans as far as what you want to do, and does music figure in that? Music will always figure in that. I will always be a musician, and it's not something I can just let go. I think it will always be there, and I will certainly help. If I'm not always with the orchestra, I'll help it progress. But at the moment, I don't really have a solid future plan, but I'm hoping at some point I'll be able to do something with my degree. I think that's an area where the country needs some serious modification, if that's the word.
That was Zuhal Sultan, founder of the National Youth Orchestra of Iraq. I also spoke with Macca Linden about how he found himself conducting the orchestra and what it's taught him.
I was in Edinburgh in September in 2008, having fish and chips in a pub, and there was a copy of the Glasgow Herald on the table, which is one of the local newspapers, and I was just flicking through it to see what was going on. And there on page 11, I think it was a headline which read, "Iraqi teen seeks maestro for a youth orchestra." And that would catch my attention. So I read it through, and it was about Zuhal Sultan, who was at that time a 17-year-old pianist in Baghdad. And she wanted a National Youth Orchestra of Iraq to unite all her different friends from all these different ethnic and religious backgrounds, and was looking for a conductor in Britain. And I said to myself immediately, I know how to do that.
So what were the next steps then that you took to help her start that and get that off the ground?
We got in touch by Skype. I returned to my home in Germany, and I contacted immediately the British Council, who do cultural relationships for Great Britain around the world. They had 2 offices in Iraq. My plan was that their logistics and finance would help us get the first year off the ground, and Zuhal's network of pals, musicians throughout Iraq around the same age as her, would be the first applicants. And from that point, Zuhal and I built up the first year of the National Youth Orchestra of Iraq.
So describe, if you can, the orchestra and the musicians that this orchestra brings together. What are these teens like? What are these young musicians like?
Well, they come partly from Baghdad, and partly from a number of Kurdish towns like Suleimania and Erbil, and also from the disputed territory towns like Kirkuk. They're between, on average, 18 and 25 years old, although we take from as early as 14 and as old as 29. And they're a real bunch of characters. Iraq is full of very, very individualistic people, and they are all tremendously passionate about classical music. They have symphonies downloaded into their iPhone, so you get no pop music from them. It's all classical, and they're completely obsessed by the whole thing. They're playing on pretty poor instruments, and they're all self-taught. One of the ways in which they could manage to teach themselves, particularly during and directly after the war, was through YouTube masterclasses.
Well, now, what made this the right time to bring the orchestra for a U.S. tour?
We have spent already 5 years, 1 course per year, building up the way in which we work and our procedures and the quality of our work. In 2011, we had our first visit abroad, and that was to Beethoven Fest in Bonn, which is just down the road from where I live in Cologne. And that was our first ability to contact musicians outside Iraq. So we were working with musicians from the Bundesjugendorchester, the National Youth Orchestra of Germany. Then in 2012, we went to Britain and worked with the Edinburgh Youth Orchestra in Edinburgh Festival Fringe. And last year we were with the French National Youth Orchestra in Aix-en-Provence. So what we've done over the years is build up a lot of intercultural competence. We've done a lot of exchange of ideas and learning. And we've become this international Iraqi diplomat. What this means to me going to the US is that the time is right to present Iraq in a different way from the way that everybody's experienced it through the media already, in a way that is much more constructive and positive and united, and which shows people the future of Iraq in the best possible way.
Well, as part of the tour, you'll be working very closely with the Elgin Youth Orchestra in Illinois. How did that relationship develop?
The Elgin Youth Orchestra in Illinois came to us, and that was a bolt out of the blue. Their music director, Randy Swiggins, sent me an email in the middle of January, which in terms of project planning is pretty late down the day, and said he'd heard about us and was very interested in knowing more. And as soon as we got talking, we understood on a conductor level exactly what kind of challenges and possibilities were ahead of us. And we got down to trying to put together a course with the Elgin Youth Symphony Orchestra in the Northern Illinois University.
When the students are there in Elgin, what will they be working on with the orchestra?
We do what we do every year. we commission a Kurdish Iraqi composer and an Arab Iraqi composer so that the diversity of the two main ethnic groups is represented on stage. So this year we're using a composer called Amir al-Safar, who is an Iraqi-American living in New York, and Abdullah Jamal Sagirma, who's the head of music in the University of Suleimania in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. Then on top of that, we're playing the Barber Violin Concerto with Angelia Cho. She's a Juilliard graduate who works with the Carnegie Hall Weill Institute, and she's just a star. She's been with us from the very start as a tutor. And then we're finishing off with Beethoven 7. So every year is always a mixture of classical repertoire and contemporary Iraqi.
What types of classes or programs will there be to bring the two youth orchestra members together?
What we do is the first week we just have the tutors, all of whom are coming from Elgin Youth Symphony Orchestra, and the Iraqi players working together alone so that they can really get to know each other's challenges and get a communication going. Then in the second week, we add the Elgin Youth Symphony Orchestra players, 14 of them to boost the strings up. But before that, we give the Elgin Youth players a day of induction about the history of Iraq, which goes back 5,000 years culturally, the geopolitics, and the kind of things that they'll expect from us as we've built up our experience over the past 5 years. We may even get them singing and dancing a bit of Kurdish or Arab music.
Well, it sounds like it's going to be a lot of fun for them. Now, You've turned in part to Kickstarter to fund part of that. What made you think Kickstarter was a good approach for funding a portion of the costs?
Kickstarter is as much about explaining the project as it is about fundraising the project. A title called the National Youth Orchestra of Iraq sends out lots of different messages to lots of different people, and it's our opportunity to get a unified, clear message out to everybody about what the youth orchestra is really about, as opposed to what people might imagine it's about. And at this early stage, 3 months before we arrive, it's important that we start building up knowledge for people about who we are and why we're coming.
So far, what has the response been like?
We've hit the 10% mark very early on, and we're pushing through various channels around America, a lot of Iraqi diaspora communities as well in America, particularly around the Illinois and Michigan area, and also in Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia and New York. So we know who to target, and we're working with them to build up the funding for that. But also, of course, classical music lovers who want to hear and see the orchestra do well.
You mentioned how this tour will help hopefully bring a different face, a different look at Iraq to the American public. What do you feel the orchestra members who are coming from the Youth Orchestra of Iraq can bring back with them from this experience?
Right. I mean, there's two simple things. The first is training. And the orchestral course, you should imagine that it's a boot camp. It's very intense. It's very disciplined. And the Elgin Youth Symphony Orchestra tutors and myself and Angelia will be delivering a lot of teaching in a very short space of time. So that teaching is designed to pack them full of knowledge so that they can go home to Iraq and carry that knowledge on in their own ensembles and in their own teaching. Iraq is a very young country with an average age of 21, so we are a national youth orchestra containing not only the youth orchestra people, but also the teachers of Iraq. It's a very intense experience of bringing back quality to Iraq to rebuild their culture in the way that they see fit.
Well, now that you've had 6 or so years to develop and evolve the orchestra, tell us a bit about what rehearsals are like and how these young musicians approach the repertoire.
We send all the music out by PDF well in advance, so I expect them to be note perfect by the time they get there. The rehearsals are a bit of a trial for me as a conductor, because on my left-hand side, I have a translator saying everything I say into Kurdish, and on my right-hand side, I have another translator saying everything I have to say into Arabic. So we actually work simultaneously in 3 different languages, which means that I keep my words very short.
And how would you say the orchestra has evolved over this time? What steps and jumps have you seen them make over the years?
The steps and jumps, like the country itself, are huge. If you look at Iraq economically, it's marked at around 10% growth a year, and the whole of the country, in some aspects, not every aspect, but in some aspect, leaps forward in that stratospheric developing world way. The orchestra started out very rough. and very unschooled in 2009, but they've taken what little tuition they get from our project and also from American Voices, who run a similar project in Iraq every year, and they've really made that work throughout the rest of the year to become even better next year. The other important thing to say is that when they do go abroad, the reception that they receive from the public of France and Britain and Germany is enormous. So they take that embedded feeling of success back to Iraq with them and want even more next year.
What has the reception been like in Iraq?
Yeah, that's a difficult question because Iraq has many facets to it. In some ways, we are not welcomed for very precise reasons. For example, last year was Baghdad was the cultural capital of the Arab world, and the Ministry of Culture wanted to invite us, but the security risk towards us was so high that our visit to Baghdad, which would have been the very first time we played in the capital, had to be cancelled. When we do play in the north of Iraq, the Kurdistan region, in Erbil or Suleimania, we're received very warmly indeed.
And I can imagine, as you just referred to, there are immense challenges to trying to make this work. What is the experience like for the musicians who are dedicated to this but have to deal with some very serious, very difficult circumstances in the rest of their lives?
Yes, I think there are a number of forces at work here. First of all, at the outset of the 2003 war, many teachers in Iraq who were highly qualified, and many coming from Russia, left. And so there was a huge brain drain of musical talent, which means that still now, many of my young players have no formal teachers in Iraq to give them a standard pedagogy or a good education, or to even help them get hold of decent quality instruments. So they teach themselves continually, and they do peer-to-peer coaching. They advise each other as best they can. The second aspect is that particularly in Baghdad, there's a problem with the role of religion in society. Some religious groups believe that music is haram, is forbidden, and should not be happening at all. And the students have to be very wary, depending on which district of Baghdad they live in, that their neighbors don't find out that they're musicians. They literally have to stay in the closet.
Over the last few years, have you seen some of these musicians move on and find ways to develop a career or take this music education to another level?
Yes. A career in music is nothing like a career that we would understand in music in the West. There is the Iraqi National Symphony Orchestra, which is now being fully funded by the Ministry of Culture in Baghdad and putting on one concert a month. Many of my players come from that orchestra. So when they go back after an NYOI course, they're playing better, they're teaching better, and they're inspired to play ensemble music, chamber music, which is something that would have been unthinkable previously. Others, like Walid, our first flute in Kirkuk, which is one of the disputed territories, which suffers a lot of terrorism, has set up his own orchestra, and he conducts it. So it's really about finding the stars in the orchestra who will unstoppably take the injection of motivation that we give them and do something creative with it that fits their own culture back home. One of the challenges, as I said before, is that the National Youth Orchestra of Iraq is a very multi-layered concept. It's about delivering good music education. It's about delivering reconciliation between otherwise separated groups. It's about fairness and meritocracy, and it's also about delivering a message that people will be surprised about in Iraq. But most of all, it's about giving hope. That sounds like a very soft thing to give, but it ends up being the most powerful factor in the whole project.
That was Paul McAlinden, conductor of the National Youth Orchestra of Iraq. More information on the orchestra, including its Kickstarter campaign, can be found on its Facebook page at facebook.com/nyo.iraq. You know you can count on our station for great classical music and programming like A Tempo throughout the summer and any time of the year. If you value the programming you hear every week, show your support for the Classical Network by becoming a member. You can make a donation anytime by going to WWFM.org and clicking on Donate Now. Thank you for your support. Thank you for listening to A Tempo. I'm your host and producer, Rachel Katz. You can listen to previous shows anytime in our webcast archive at WWFM.org. Join me next week for another look at the news and insight into some of the challenges and trends in the world of the performing arts. A Tempo is a production of the Classical Network and is made possible in part by a grant from the Frank and Lydia Bergen Foundation and the support of our listener members.